A father took his little boy deep into the woods of Tennessee. Said it was a camping trip. Told him to wait by the tree. And then he vanished. Left him alone. No food. No map. No goodbye. But what he didn't know was this. Someone was watching. Not a man. Not a hunter. A retired German shepherd. Trained to protect, born to fight, and led by something greater than instinct. Share this story if you believe no child should ever be forgotten. Comment amen if you believe in quiet miracles. Subscribe for more stories that prove God's love still moves in this world. May God bless you, your family, and every soul still searching for light. The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the cloud cover, casting long, quiet shadows over the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. It was early autumn, and the crisp air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine needles. A slight wind rustled the treetops, while birds called out occasionally from deep within the forest canopy. Along the winding backroads of Sevier County, a black SUV slowed to a stop near the gravel edge of a remote hiking trailhead. From the passenger seat, a young boy peered out eagerly at the wall of trees beyond. Lucas Carter, 6 years old, was a slender boy with sandy blonde hair that curled at the edges beneath his baseball cap. His eyes were large and round, the kind of soft hazel that could look golden in the sunlight. He wore a light blue hoodie with a dinosaur stitched on the front, slightly too big for his frame, and jeans scuffed at the knees. Tied tightly around his waist was a red flannel shirt, his adventure cape, as he called it. Clutched in his hands was a plastic folder containing a carefully drawn picture. A bright scene of a father and son holding hands beside a tent, surrounded by smiling animals and oversized trees. It was his gift for his dad, a souvenir of the father-son camping trip they had been planning for weeks. Beside him in the driver's seat sat Brian Carter, his 41-year-old father. Brian was a tall, broad-shouldered man with clean-shaven features and a sharp, corporate look about him. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and he wore a brand-name hiking jacket that still had the tags tucked inside. Beneath his tailored jeans and boots, everything about Brian spoke of control and calculation. He had once been the golden boy of a Nashville tech startup, now semi-retired after selling his shares. To the outside world, Brian seemed like the kind of father who posted about family hikes and Instagram-worthy trail selfies. But behind closed doors, he had grown increasingly cold since marrying his second wife, Allison. Allison was not here, of course. She had made it very clear Lucas was not her responsibility. As Brian stepped out of the SUV, he kept his movements brisk and focused. He opened the trunk, pulling out a brand new camping backpack, untouched. "Come on, buddy," he called with forced cheerfulness. "Let's start our adventure." Lucas jumped out with excitement, slinging his child-sized bag over his shoulders and skipping to catch up. "Dad, I brought the drawing for our tent. Do you think we'll see raccoons?" "Maybe," Brian said, barely glancing at him. "Keep close to the trail. And don't wander off." They began the hike, moving into the forest along a narrow path that wound through thick clusters of cedar, maple, and birch. Lucas, humming softly, marveled at the way sunlight broke through in patches, making the undergrowth shimmer. Squirrels darted across fallen logs. The occasional bird call echoed above. Brian said little. His eyes were constantly scanning the trail ahead, checking his watch every few minutes. They hiked in silence for nearly an hour before reaching a clearing. It was quiet, eerily so. The birds had gone silent. A fallen tree lay rotting at the edge of the glade, and the air felt damp, heavy with an unfamiliar musk. Brian stopped. "Here's good," he said flatly. Lucas blinked. "Aren't we going to set up the tent?" "Later," Brian replied. "I just need to step back to the car for a minute. I forgot something. Can I come?" "No," Brian said sharply. "Stay here, don't move. I'll be right back." Lucas's smile faltered. "Okay, but don't take long." Brian patted him on the head with mechanical detachment. 5 minutes. Then he turned and walked briskly back the way they came, never once looking over his shoulder. Lucas waited, and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. He sat on a fallen log, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. The drawing in his folder started to bend at the corners. His legs swung slowly, no longer with excitement. "Dad," he called out weakly, but only the wind answered, rustling through the leaves. Then something moved in the shadows beyond the glade, silent, low to the ground. A glint of eyes, dark and watchful. Far away, another pair of eyes had seen everything. Earlier that day, Ranger Joe Miller had been returning from a foraging trip near the North Ridge. Joe was a man in his early 60s, lean and weathered like old timber, with silver hair tied loosely behind his head and eyes the color of cold stone. Once a national park ranger, he had left the service after losing his 10-year-old son in a rock slide during a hiking accident years ago, a wound he never spoke of. He now lived off-grid in a cabin deeper in the forest, far from the reaches of cell towers or city noise. Locals spoke of him like a ghost, helpful, reclusive, not quite gone. Following him loyally was Max, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat and amber eyes filled with quiet intelligence. Max had once served as a K-9 in a search and rescue unit until an injury to his hind leg retired him early. Joe had taken him in after finding the dog abandoned near a burned-out training facility. Since then, the two had formed a bond that didn't require many words. Joe had spotted the SUV on the Ridge Trail earlier, unusual this time of year. Then he saw the father, neatly dressed, no map, no radio, no tent. Just a boy. Something in Joe's gut had tightened. And now, crouched in the underbrush not far from the clearing, Max's ears perked up. The scent was unmistakable: fear. Child. Predator. Joe followed Max's lead, his steps silent over the forest floor. Back in the clearing, Lucas began to cry. Not loudly, just quiet, silent sobs that caught in his throat. He had never been left alone in the forest before. His hands were shaking. A branch cracked in the woods behind him, and something growled. The forest in Sevier County held its breath. Evening had begun its slow descent, drawing a dusky veil across the Smoky Mountains. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their skeletal limbs outlined against a sky that had turned the color of damp ash. The breeze had shifted, colder now, heavier, and carrying with it the metallic scent of earth disturbed. Somewhere high in the canopy, a crow let out a single, stuttering caw before flying off. Down below, in a clearing carved by time and wind, a 6-year-old boy sat still on a fallen log, eyes wide, ears sharp, fingers wrapped tightly around the handles of his backpack. Lucas Carter had stopped crying. Instead, he stared at the ground just a few feet in front of him, where the wet earth held something new, something alive. Impressed into the mud were prints, large and feline, with unmistakable clawless pads and long, curved indentations. 3 of them, then 4, then 5, leading in a half-circle around the tree stump he had been sitting on. Something had passed through here recently. Something big. Lucas bent down slowly, curiosity overtaking fear. He touched the edge of one of the prints. Still damp, still fresh. His stomach flipped. "It's a cat," he whispered to himself. "But really big." Somewhere in the underbrush, a twig cracked. Lucas snapped up, eyes scanning the shadows. He could feel something watching, but he couldn't tell where from. Every leaf seemed still, every shadow suddenly deeper. He hugged his drawing folder against his chest, as if it could protect him. Back up the trail, hidden just beyond the ridge, Max had already picked up the scent. The German shepherd moved like smoke through the tall grass, low to the ground, cautious but swift. His black and tan coat blended into the tree trunks as he crept forward, eyes locked ahead, nostrils flaring with the unmistakable aroma of feline musk, mixed with something fainter: child. Max was 7 years old, and while his hind legs still bore the slight stiffness of old injury, it hadn't dulled his instincts. In another life, he would have barked and lunged. But now, trained in restraint and patience, he only observed. Behind him, Joe Miller followed in silence, his body moving with the kind of care born from years of practice. He kept a hand loosely on the walking stick he'd carved himself from a cedar branch. His long coat brushed the tops of ferns as he leaned down, inspecting the faint drag marks on the trail. "Something's wrong," he muttered to himself. Then louder to Max, "You smell the boy?" Max turned his head slightly, gave the faintest nod of a huff, and moved ahead. Meanwhile, Brian Carter was already a half-mile away, boots pounding against the trail like a man late for a meeting. He glanced behind him once, not for his son, but for any witnesses. His heartbeat remained even, his jaw clenched. As he walked, he pulled a phone from his coat pocket and dialed a number. On the other end, Allison Carter answered with irritation in her voice. "Is it done?" Allison, 35, was a striking woman, with a statuesque figure and razor-cut auburn hair always tucked into a tight bun. She had once been a high-end real estate broker in Atlanta before marrying Brian and moving into a colder, wealthier, quieter life. But beneath the designer coats and perfect smiles was a mind as sharp and cruel as broken glass. To her, Lucas was never a child. He was a threat to inheritance, to peace, to the curated perfection she was building. Brian exhaled slowly. "He's alone now. Should be quick." There was a pause. "You didn't see the cat, right?" Allison asked. "I told you they roam that sector. That's the point." "No," Brian said coldly. "But he will." He hung up before she could respond. Back in the woods, Lucas stood now, stepping carefully toward the brush line. He wanted to believe his dad would come back, but his chest hurt in a new way. Not the fear of animals, but something deeper, like being erased. He turned at the sound of leaves rustling. Something moved again, slower this time, more cautious. And then a pair of eyes, low to the ground, peering through the shadows, they blinked. Not yellow, not red, amber. Familiar. Gentle. Lucas froze. Max stepped out slowly, making himself known, head tilted ever so slightly. His tail didn't wag, but neither did he growl. The boy and the dog regarded one another in a kind of reverent stillness. "Hi," Lucas whispered. From deeper in the brush, Joe emerged as well. He kept his distance, cautious not to startle the child. "You all right, kid?" he asked, voice gravelly but not unkind. Lucas blinked. "Are you a ranger?" "Used to be," Joe replied. "Name's Joe. This here's Max. You got a name?" "Lucas." Joe stepped forward slowly, eyes moving across the boy. No scratches, no broken skin, just dirt and fear. "Where's your dad?" Lucas looked down. "He said he forgot something, and he'd come back. But it's been really long." Joe's brows furrowed. He motioned toward the ground. "You see those prints?" Lucas nodded. Joe squatted next to one. "Mountain lion. Male, big one. You're lucky we got here when we did." Max stepped closer, gently pressing his body beside Lucas's leg, like a living barrier. The boy smiled faintly and reached to stroke his fur. Max accepted it without protest. Joe exhaled and stood. "All right, you're coming with us. You can't stay here, not overnight." Lucas hesitated. "But, what if my dad comes back?" Joe's face hardened. He exchanged a look with Max. "I wouldn't count on it." That evening, as the forest turned to charcoal and blue, Joe led Lucas through a lesser-known side trail. It wasn't a path tourists used, but one built from memory and old instincts. After nearly an hour, they reached a wooden cabin, small and tucked beneath two weeping birches. The porch light flickered on, powered by a solar panel rigged above the door. It looked like something out of an old children's book, half magic, half forgotten. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, smoke, and faint traces of lavender oil. The fireplace crackled as Joe lit a small fire, and Max curled near it while Lucas sat on a woven rug, his backpack still clutched in his lap. Joe handed the boy a cup of warm water with honey. "Ain't got cocoa, sorry." Lucas took it, nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Joe." Joe turned to Max. "We'll need to head back tomorrow. Get more answers." Max's ears perked. And outside, just beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved in the darkness again. The forest at night was a different creature altogether. It breathed slower, deeper, as if keeping secrets in every branch and root. Mist curled over the damp earth like ghostly fingers, and the temperature dropped until even the stones seemed to hold their breath. In the small clearing where Joe Miller's cabin stood, the glow of the fireplace lit the windows from within, casting flickering orange shadows that danced on the wood-paneled walls. Inside, Lucas sat curled up on a woven blanket by the hearth, Max stretched beside him like a sentinel. The boy's eyes had grown heavy, lulled by warmth and safety, but his hand remained buried in Max's fur, as if afraid the dog would vanish like everything else in his short life. Joe watched quietly from a corner chair, his elbow resting on the armrest carved with faded initials, J+T. The flames popped now and then, and Joe's gaze was far away, somewhere deeper than memory. Lucas stirred and looked up. "Mr. Joe, will the big cat come here?" Joe's eyes came back to focus. He studied the boy a moment before answering. "No, son. Not here. Max and I, well, we're good at keeping things out." Lucas nodded slowly, trusting that in a way only children and animals could. He leaned back into the warmth of Max's coat. But Joe's thoughts didn't settle. That face, that fear in Lucas's eyes. It wasn't just fear of the wild. It was abandonment, betrayal, the kind of wound no bandage could fix. And it stirred something inside Joe he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. It had happened just an hour earlier, though it already felt like another world. The path back from the glade had wound down toward a rocky stream, swollen with recent rain. Joe had been leading Lucas carefully across the slick stones when Max froze. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body stiffened. His ears perked, tail raised, not wagging but rigid. A second later, Joe heard it too. The rustle of movement, low, slow, and intentional. From the thicket just beyond the opposite bank, two yellow-green eyes emerged. The shape followed, lean, muscular, obsidian-black fur so dark it absorbed the moonlight. A black panther, larger than any Joe had seen since his ranger days. Not typical in these parts, but not impossible. Perhaps a released exotic. Perhaps worse, wild-born and invisible until now. Lucas saw it and froze. His hands clutched Joe's sleeve. Before Joe could draw his knife, Max moved. With a snarl that came from deep in his chest, Max leapt across the stream, placing himself squarely between the predator and the boy. His stance was pure instinct, hackles raised, teeth bared, tail stiff behind him like a rod of iron. The panther growled low, its body low to the ground, muscles rippling under its shadowy coat. For several tense seconds they circled each other, two predators, one for protection, one for prey. Max didn't flinch. The panther took a step forward, claws clicking softly on rock. Max lunged forward just enough to bark, loud and sharp, breaking the tension. Joe grabbed Lucas, hoisted him in his arms, and backed slowly across the creek toward the cabin trail. "Max, come!" he shouted. But Max didn't move. Only when the panther gave a final growl and slinked back into the shadows did Max slowly retreat, his eyes never leaving the underbrush. He backed across the water and returned to Joe and Lucas, limping slightly, but uninjured. Now back in the warmth of the cabin, Max lay quietly beside Lucas, eyes still alert, ears twitching at every creak in the floor or wind against the glass. Joe sat across from them, a tin cup of black coffee in hand, untouched. His eyes didn't leave the boy. Not for a long while. He saw it again, the fear, the small frame, the wild desperation. Tommy, his son, had been 8, not much older than Lucas. A wiry kid with a mop of curly brown hair and a laugh that used to echo off the canyon walls when they hiked together. Until that one day. The rock slide. The unreachable cliff. The voice screaming Dad. Until it was gone. Joe had never forgiven himself. Not for going too far. Not for looking away. He blinked and looked down at his cup, his hands suddenly trembling. Max shifted his head as if sensing the weight in the room. Lucas stirred again. "Mr. Joe, can I stay with you tonight?" Joe exhaled softly, the edge of his voice catching. "Yeah, kid. As long as you need." Later, as the fire burned low, Joe stood outside on the porch. The moon had risen, pale and high, filtered through fog. He lit a small oil lantern and set it on the railing. In his pocket was a worn photograph, Tommy, standing by a river, holding a toy compass and beaming. Joe rubbed his thumb over the faded image. Inside, Lucas slept soundly, Max curled protectively around him. Joe whispered to the night, to the trees, to the ghosts. "I couldn't save mine, but maybe I was sent to save this one." The wind outside the cabin shifted at midnight, brushing against the birch trees like invisible fingers testing their strength. Rain had come and gone in a quiet hush, leaving the leaves glistening under the moonlight like silver coins scattered by a forgotten god. Inside, a lantern burned low beside the fireplace, casting golden light across the rustic wooden floor, the worn rug, and the boy now curled up on a second-hand cot with a thick flannel blanket tucked around him. Joe sat nearby in his old rocking chair, fingers calloused from years of mountain living, one leg crossed loosely over the other. He nursed a chipped mug of chamomile tea, something he hadn't brewed in years. Lucas, though nearly asleep, stirred and whispered through the quiet, his voice almost afraid to exist in the same space as the truth. "Mr. Joe, I don't think my dad's coming back." Joe set down his mug without a sound. His tired blue eyes met the boy's. "Why do you say that, son?" Lucas sat up a little, blanket bunched around his waist. He clutched the drawing pad he'd brought into the forest, still rolled with rubber bands. "Before we came out here, he told me it was just a trip. Said we'd go hiking. He said we could look for wild cats because I drew them in school." He paused, lips trembling. "I gave him a drawing of us together. I put it in his backpack so he wouldn't forget me." Joe didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt when a child was walking the edge of something they didn't want to admit. Lucas kept going, eyes distant. "We walked for hours. Then he told me to wait by the tree stump while he went to get something from the truck. But there was no truck. He just went." The boy blinked slowly, trying to swallow it all down. "I waited until the moon came out." Joe's chest tightened. He didn't need more proof. But still, something primal in him needed to see. He stood, motioned for Lucas to stay, and slipped out into the damp night with Max at his side. The moonlight barely pierced the fog as Joe made his way back to the trail. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the clearing again. Max stayed close, ears twitching, body tense but calm. Near the tree stump, Joe crouched, brushing wet leaves aside. His hand froze over the imprint of a boot print, size 11, deep in the mud, walking away from the stump with no return prints beside it. He followed the trail further. 3 more adult footprints. Then nothing. No turnaround. No struggle. Just departure. Max sniffed the air and growled softly, not in fear, but in recognition. Joe exhaled, stood, and headed back. When they returned, Lucas had dozed off again. Joe stood for a long time in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of the boy's chest. Then he crossed the room to the wooden side table, where an old satellite phone sat beneath a dusty box of .22 cartridges. He hadn't used the thing in years, but it still held charge. He dialed a number etched into memory. It rang once, then again, a third time. Then a voice, weak but sharp, answered. "Hello? Mrs. Helen?" A pause. "Who's this?" Her voice trembled. "It's Joe Miller. You probably don't remember me, but I worked search and rescue back in '06. You once sent a donation for a dog we saved, Max. You said you'd never forget that name." Another pause. Then Joe. "Joe Miller? Why are you calling?" He looked toward Lucas. "I have your grandson." The line went silent. Then a sound like fabric rustling, then sobbing. "Is he alive? Are you sure?" "He's safe," Joe said. "But it's bad. He says Brian left him out here. I found him in a clearing near Panther's Ridge. Alone." On the other end, Helen sobbed again. "I begged that man to let Lucas stay with me while I went through treatment. I knew something was wrong. His new wife didn't want the boy. Said he was inconvenient. I should have pushed harder." Joe's voice dropped low. "He didn't just neglect him, Helen. He left him where wild cats roam. If Max hadn't found him..." Helen's voice sharpened with age-old fire. "Listen to me, Joe. Brian's not just careless. He's calculating. And if he thinks this boy surviving threatens him or his wife, he will do anything, to bury the truth." Joe's fingers clenched around the phone. "Not while I'm still breathing." The next morning came slowly. Fog lingered between the trees like a question waiting to be asked. Joe fixed a simple breakfast, oatmeal with honey, and watched as Lucas, still in yesterday's clothes, ate in silence, Max never more than a foot away. After breakfast, Joe handed Lucas a flint stick and a piece of dry bark. "You ever make fire, kid?" Lucas shook his head. Well, no better day to learn. That morning, Joe began teaching the boy simple things: how to find dry kindling, how to listen to the wind for signs of rain, how to track movement by broken leaves and bent grass. Lucas listened intently, and though the worry never fully left his face, there were moments, small ones, where something like peace flickered in his eyes. Max followed them through every lesson. The big shepherd had adopted Lucas as his charge, sleeping by his cot, walking at his side, standing between him and every unfamiliar sound. He wasn't just a protector, he was becoming family. That night, as stars bloomed above the trees and the fire crackled in the pit out front, Joe took out a second-hand guitar with missing frets and strummed a tune he hadn't played in years. Lucas, curled in a blanket, watched in awe. "Did your son play?" Lucas asked. Joe nodded. Tommy loved music. He used to think the forest had its own kind of song. He called the wind the whispering choir. Lucas smiled faintly. "Can I hear that song someday?" Joe looked at him for a long time. "Yeah, Lucas. One day you will." The sun barely touched the canopy when the forest grew still again, as if nature itself sensed something wrong before it arrived. The wind died. Birds fell quiet. Even the insects held their breath. Somewhere along the muddy slope that led back to Panther's Ridge, the crunch of heavy boots broke the silence. Brian Parker walked ahead of the others, his face tightened into a scowl, though to a casual observer it might appear as grief. His once pristine khaki jacket was soaked with morning dew, but it was the man behind him that commanded more attention. Jonas Trask, his newly hired consultant, was a towering figure, 6'4", thick neck, cropped blonde hair, and arms too muscular to be just for show. He wore a black tactical vest with a side holster that clung to his ribs like a warning. A former Marine turned private security, Jonas had the kind of eyes that scanned every treetop before stepping twice on the same patch of ground. Behind him was another man, lighter, wiry, with a scar running from ear to chin, carrying a thermal scanner and a scoped rifle slung across his back. His name was Caleb. They had one mission: recover the body. Destroy what's left. Brian, always the smooth-talking real estate developer in public, had shifted into another man entirely in these woods. Guilt didn't touch his shoulders. Only inconvenience. "We don't want hikers finding bones in 6 months," he muttered under his breath. "If the cat didn't finish the job, we clean it up." Jonas gave a slight nod but said nothing. He wasn't here to question motives, just to get paid. Yet Caleb, who'd seen more than his fair share of darkness, narrowed his eyes at Brian's choice of words. Something didn't sit right. This wasn't a recovery mission. This felt like elimination. Back at the cabin, Joe stood beneath the porch awning, one hand on the edge of the wooden beam, eyes scanning the tree line. Max sat beside him, not wagging, not whining, just staring. Still and statuesque. The hair at the base of his neck had risen 3 times already that morning. Something was coming. Joe turned and moved back inside. "Lucas," he said in a calm but firm voice, "come with me." The boy, who'd been drawing in a corner using old charcoal sticks, looked up, confused. "I need you to be real quiet and do exactly what I say. No questions." Lucas followed him into the back room, where Joe pushed open a trapdoor hidden beneath an old dresser. A short staircase led down into a storm shelter carved from stone, reinforced with steel. Inside were blankets, an old mattress, water jugs, and emergency supplies. Joe knelt to Lucas's level. "No matter what you hear up there, you stay down here. Don't come out until I say so, you understand?" Lucas nodded, his voice tiny. "Is it the panther again?" "No," Joe said, voice heavy, worse. He shut the trapdoor, layered the dresser back over it, and stood still for a moment. Max had already stationed himself near the front door, eyes fixed. Back in the woods, the men reached the clearing. Brian stopped, gestured. "This is where I left him. Right there, by the stump." Caleb scanned the area with his handheld thermal scope. "No recent heat signatures," he said. "But animals wouldn't leave bones just laying around if they dragged him." Jonas squatted by the tree stump, running his fingers through the damp earth. "No blood. Just old boot prints." Brian stiffened. "You calling me a liar?" Jonas met his eyes calmly. Just saying, something doesn't add up. Caleb circled the area, and then paused by a tree. You know what else is strange? He said, tapping the bark. Broken limb, about 5 feet up. Like someone climbed it recently. Not something a panther would need to do. Brian's voice sharpened. I said this is where it happened. Jonas glanced back at him, his voice flat. Then we should be looking for a trail. If the kid's body was dragged, it'll leave signs. But Caleb muttered under his breath. Unless the kid walked out. Brian's eyes flickered. That's impossible. But Caleb wasn't convinced anymore. Inside the cabin, Joe stood with a shotgun now resting behind the doorway. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't naive either. This wasn't just about a child left in the woods anymore. This was about men who returned with guns under the guise of grief. Max paced once across the room, then stopped at the front window and growled. Joe looked out. There, movement. He turned the lantern low and waited. In the darkness below, Lucas sat with a flashlight and Max's old collar in his hands. He held it like a talisman, rubbing the letters MEX with his thumb. And then, unprompted, he whispered to no one. I heard him that night. He was talking to the quiet, to memory. The night before his father led him into the woods, Lucas had crept downstairs. He'd been thirsty. He had just reached for a glass when he heard Brian's voice on the phone in the kitchen, low and clipped. She'll be out of treatment in weeks, Brian said, frustrated. We can't let her get custody. A kid like him ruins everything. Then Allison's voice came through, cold, sharp, and emotionless. One child doesn't get to decide our future. Handle it. Lucas had backed away slowly, heart pounding. That was the first time he realized something terrible was coming. He hadn't known what to do. Now, sitting underground, he realized he might never have the chance to confront them again. Outside, the sound of a twig snapping made Joe flinch. He peered out again, 3 men moving quietly but not like hikers. One had a rifle. Another was scanning with a scope. They were trained. Joe turned to Max. Let's hope you're still the same dog I trained years ago. Max responded with a low chuff, ears alert. Joe opened the back door silently and slipped out, looping through a side trail toward the edge of the clearing. He had no plan to shoot unless they forced his hand, but he had to know how close they were. In the woods, Caleb had paused. Brian, what now? I've seen cover-up jobs before, but this one? There's no corpse. No predator signs. You're lying. Brian's jaw tensed. You don't get to talk to me like that. I get to call out murder when I smell it. Jonas, standing beside them, said nothing, but his fingers tightened on his weapon. The morning sky had turned the color of pale gold when the sound of gravel crunching echoed through the trees. A convoy of 2 black and white cruisers, 1 unmarked SUV, and a forestry department truck pulled up outside Joe's cabin at the break of dawn. The forest, soaked from overnight rain, shimmered under the low mist, and beams of light pierced between the branches like judgment from above. Joe stepped onto the porch, his frame tall and unwavering despite the tension in his jaw. The door behind him creaked open as Lucas, small and fragile, stepped into view. He wore Joe's oversized flannel shirt, sleeves rolled nearly to his shoulders, and the same hiking boots that had carried him into the woods days before. His eyes, though tired, no longer held fear, they held fire. Beside the boy stood Max, the 12-year-old German shepherd whose eyes followed every human move with clinical precision. His coat was flecked with gray, his frame lean and battle-tested, but his spirit unyielding. Max had not left Lucas's side once. Not when the wind howled. Not when strangers approached. Sheriff Carla Monroe was the first out of the SUV. She was in her late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with deep laugh lines hardened over the years by tragedy more than joy. A former Army MP turned small-town sheriff, she wore her authority not like a weapon but a weight. Her dark gray uniform was spotless, and her salt and pepper hair was tightly braided down her back. "Joe," she said with a curt nod, "you better have one hell of an explanation." Joe responded quietly, "It's not mine to give. He'll tell it." Carla turned her gaze to Lucas and softened slightly. "You sure about this, son?" Lucas nodded once, then stepped forward. "My name is Lucas Parker. My dad brought me into the forest and left me. He said it was a camping trip, but he just walked away. There was silence among the law enforcement crew, except for the click of an officer's pen. Lucas took a deep breath. That night, I heard growling. A panther or something. I screamed. But it wasn't my dad who came. It was Max. He saved me. He reached down and rested a hand on the German shepherd's back. The dog stayed still, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. Then Joe found us. He didn't know me, but he helped me anyway. He hid me when the men came back, my dad and 2 other guys with guns. They were looking to make it disappear, not to rescue me. Carla raised her hand to signal her deputy. Is this true? She asked, now directed at Joe. Joe nodded once. I've got footprints, broken twigs, even a leftover canteen they dropped while circling my cabin. And if that's not enough, Max chased one of them off when he got too close. The deputy beside her, a young man named Officer Riley with cropped hair and a nervous twitch in his jaw, whispered into her ear. We just got confirmation. Helen Parker made a call days ago saying her grandson was missing, and she suspected foul play. But the father claimed he'd never gone camping at all. No search was ever filed. Carla's face darkened. Where's Brian Parker now? Coming up the west trail with Jonas and the other man, Joe replied. Carla radioed her team. All units, secure perimeter. I want Brian Parker detained the moment he steps into visual range. It didn't take long. Minutes later, the woods stirred with motion again as Brian, his shirt partially unbuttoned, emerged from the tree line. Behind him trailed Jonas Trask, silent and stone-faced, and Caleb, whose expression had shifted into something close to regret. When Brian saw the cruisers, he froze. Then he saw Lucas, standing between Joe and Max. His voice cracked. Son, my God, how did you? Lucas didn't move. You left me to die. Brian's expression twisted. No, I was attacked. I went to get help. Liar, Lucas said, louder this time, his voice clearer, stronger. You told Allison that I couldn't get in your way anymore. Carla stepped forward, badge displayed. Brian Parker, you are under arrest for attempted murder, child endangerment, and obstruction of justice. Hands where I can see them. Brian sputtered, his eyes flicking from officer to officer. You're taking a child's word over mine? I'm his father. Jonas stepped forward. Sheriff, Caleb and I were hired to find the body. Not the kid. Parker gave us a false story. There's no denying it. Caleb nodded. He never wanted to find him alive. He wanted to erase him. Brian's shoulders slumped as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. This is a mistake, he muttered, but no one listened. 2 days later, in a sunlit courtroom in Chattanooga, Judge Elaine Morrison, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes and silver curls, reviewed the case. After brief but clear testimony from both Joe and Lucas, the court ruled that Helen Carter, Lucas's maternal grandmother, would be granted full legal custody. Helen, seated at the front with a pale scarf wrapped around her thinning white hair, reached for her cane and stood slowly. Her voice shook as she spoke. Your Honor, I'm deeply grateful. But I've been sick for some time. I'm not sure I can give Lucas everything he needs right now. The courtroom stilled. Helen turned toward Joe. He found him. He saved him. And from what I hear, he's the first man Lucas has ever truly trusted. Joe, standing silently beside Lucas and Max, looked as if he might speak, but Lucas beat him to it. I want to stay with Joe and Max. Just until Grandma gets better. Please. The judge studied them all for a long moment before nodding. Permission granted. Temporary custody to Joseph Carter. Supervised by Child Welfare. Until such time as Ms. Carter recovers. Lucas ran forward, threw his arms around Helen, then turned to Joe. Can I call you Uncle Joe? Joe's gruff voice was quiet. You can call me whatever you want, kid. And Max? Joe looked down at the dog, who had lifted his head in pride. He's your forever friend now. Lucas grinned. Then I guess we're finally home. Lucas's journey wasn't just a story of survival. It was a quiet reminder that when the world turns its back on you, God often sends help in the most unexpected forms. A battle-worn dog. A grieving man in hiding. A silent bond born from danger and love. In the deep woods of Tennessee, where fear lingered in every rustle and betrayal cut deeper than the cold, it wasn't power or planning that saved a child. It was loyalty, faith, and something greater watching from above. The world calls it coincidence. We call it grace. You may not find yourself lost in the forest, but perhaps you've been lost in heartbreak, in grief, in silence. And then, without warning, a voice called, a hand reached, a door opened. That wasn't chance. That was God whispering, "You are not forgotten." This story reminds us that miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they have fur. Sometimes they knock gently when we've given up. So if you believe that every soul deserves a second chance, that God still works through the faithful and the forgotten, then this story is meant for you. Share this video to give someone hope today. Comment Amen if you believe God still sends miracles in silence. Subscribe to this channel to keep these stories alive and spreading light. And may God bless you, protect your family, and send comfort to every heart still waiting to be found. Amen if you believe.